This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week my co-host Dalia Shendlin and I, except today because she's away, so today it's just me, but every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. And as always, you can also support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and becoming a patron. Every little helps. My guest today is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto and the author of a new book entitled Latinos in Israel, Language and Unexpected Citizenship. It was published last year by University of Indiana Press. Professor Alejandro Paz, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, Gilad. I'm glad to be here.
So what can you tell us about the very specific demographic group that you chose to focus on, and why do you think it's a good case study to explore the broader questions that you wanted to explore about citizenship, etc.?
Yeah, so first of all, most people, when I tell them I worked on Latino unauthorized immigrants or labor migrants in Israel, said, really, there's Latinos in Israel? And I would say, yes, there are quite a few. But I never thought of them as separate from the much broader phenomenon of labor migration and now also asylum seekers in Israel. That is, people who've come from abroad for various reasons, partially through guest worker programs that were started by the Israeli state, whether they be working in home care, elder care, or whether they be working as agricultural workers or in construction. So there was the guest worker programs, and then there was groups of people who just arrived, often through enormous chance, like just contingencies of, and I can tell you a story about how contingent, which one that I review in the book. And then they started some kind of stream of migration afterwards. And that's the case of most Latin Americans who came here and began calling themselves the Latinos of Israel.
How are they different from other groups, say Filipinos or Africans and others?
Yeah, so there's, obviously many differences. Many Filipinos come here on guest worker programs. They're the largest group, the most highly identified group in kind of quote-unquote foreign workers, as many Israelis call them, in Israel. The Latinos, on the other hand, and usually came through tourist visas and then just overstayed them. It's impossible to know exactly how many Latinos there were at any given time, but estimates range between 10,000 and 20,000, probably at their height. And then depending on deportations or whatnot, they may have gone down. They may be continuing to grow right now. I haven't really seen any new statistics on that. But by around 2010, there was probably between 15 and 20,000 Latin Americans and their children in Israel.
And that is really the main issue here. Yeah. Their children. I mean, this sort of like the fact that they're not really guest workers par excellence. They are settling down to an extent and integrating into the broader culture. And in this sense, as you said in the beginning, they're not very different from other migrant groups all over the world. Yeah. But then again, there's this very specific setting of the fact that they're in Israel, the Jewish state, that has a very specific immigration policy that caters by and large only to Jews. How do they fit into that?
Yeah, so that's really what interests me, is like what, in a sense, how does a group that first of all, any immigrant group undergoes a transformation, right? Even maintaining some kind of cultural heritage or whatnot, everything gets transformed in and by that process of settling, of finding work, and so on and so forth. So the Israeli state, with the nation law or the citizenship law and the law of return, is a very specific example that isn't completely unique in the world, but has a certain kind of history and a certain kind of uniqueness that comes out of the kind of colonial period of Mandate Palestine. And in particular, the separation between Jews and Arabs or / Palestinians, right? And so when Latinos and other labor migrants began to settle here, just as they have settled everywhere else in the world, people never just come only for work. They need to live and work and have leisure time and develop all kinds of social networks and other social activities.
A community in one word.
A community in one word. When that happens, they become transformed. Their social relations that they left behind are transformed. And that transformation really interested me. And so there's a certain kind of transformation that occurred vis-a-vis what I would like to say call the public life of Israel, right? Vis-a-vis Hebrew as the language of public life of Hebrew, vis-a-vis how they understood themselves as coming from a certain place and understood themselves as ultimately potential citizens of Israel.
Yeah, but then again, they cannot ignore the structural impediment of that, which is that unlike in other countries, they really have no horizon in that respect. Or, well, in retrospect, it may be more complicated than that. But letter of the law does not provide for them any kind of avenue to become full citizens, even de jure.
Well, here we get to a distinction which I prefer between formal citizenship and substantive citizenship. So it's true that
But aren't they two connected? Sorry.
Oh, of course they are. They're definitely connected, and we can argue about it. But certainly formal recognized citizens have access, ideally, to all of the kind of sets of rights that are involved in citizenship, whether these be civil rights, political rights, or social rights, the rights to kind of community and reproduce themselves and to benefit from the economy, as well as civil rights, to be able to go to school, or political rights to be able to be part of the political process. In practice, no matter where you go, you will find that citizenship is highly differentiated. And yet the promise of citizenship that was enunciated, if you will, about 200 years ago with the American and French revolutions still ignites in people the desire to, even if they don't have full citizenship or aren't part of the group that really enjoys all the substantive benefits, so here we got to the formal versus substantive, to try to change those impediments. And that's something that happened here as well. Even with the restrictive controls on citizenship that are part of the kind of constitution of the Israeli state, many NGOs, many people themselves, we see this now with asylum seekers as well, do make claims on the state to be recognized for some of those substantive rights, even if they do not have formal citizenship. And that's something that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's really one of the most interesting points that you show in the book, this rather peculiar relationship between the formal and the substantive citizenships, because on the surface you would think that the substantive citizenship is a derivative of the formal citizenship, and only once you acquire the formal citizenship then you can start talking about substantive citizenship. But conversely, they've used what they've acquired, their acquis, to say it in more fancy words, in respect to their substantive citizenship, to make claims for formal citizenship.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So, and we can think of this civil rights movement in the U.S. where some of the formal distinctions over African Americans were done away with, and yet there's still a struggle for full substantive citizenship of many African American communities and Latino communities in the U.S. So formal citizenship never has yet to equal full equality anywhere in the world. And this was something actually that some of the Enlightenment thinkers who discussed citizenship and what for kind of a modern polity understood already, whether you think about Rousseau or others of that time. They understood the problems of actual equality versus, or what the abstract ideal of equality versus all the concrete kinds of differences that play out and create hierarchies across populations. And so likewise, and this is why I bring a kind of, we haven't talked about it yet, but a linguistic anthropological sensitivity to this question. The Latinos understood themselves as non-citizens. They understood themselves as, highly deportable, to use a term from one theorist of this kind of stuff, Nicholas de Genova. And yet, when their children were growing up here, their children were becoming educated. They spoke Hebrew at home, even with parents that didn't necessarily understand Hebrew fully. they began to understand themselves as potentially having claims. And that's really interesting to me. And it's not just the fact that they spoke Hebrew, but the way they spoke Hebrew. That's key to this sense of transformation, the sense of, I have claims here. I'm living here for a long time. My children are growing up here. There was never a response from the kind of political elite to the claims of the parents, right? So even if you had lived here for 20 years and you spoke Hebrew, you weren't getting any support from the political elites, the politicians of this country, for that to become a claim for formal citizenship. Where it got interesting, though, is that the children who were growing up here, not unlike the dreamers in the United States, were able to get some political uptake for their claims. And that's something that I discuss.
Yeah, exactly. It's not only the way they used the language and the whole discourse, but also how they flaunted it. In a way, it was an axe to grind. They said, we speak Hebrew flawlessly. We go to Hebrew schools. We want to serve in the army. I mean, there's really no better entry ticket into Israeli society than that. I mean, they wanted to be more Israeli than Israelis and use that in a way as a way to say, broaden our formal citizenship or, make us the Israelis that we are.
Yeah, this is why I say that they were taking up Israeli public life, right? One of my points in the book is that all too often scholars who are writing about highly marginalized, highly precarious populations like labor migrants tend to see them as outside of public life. They couldn't possibly be paying attention to what's happening in Israeli political life because they don't speak the language, they can't understand the news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, what I try to show in the book is that actually they had nowhere to hide. There's there's this term, in the shadows, which is used a lot to describe populations like them. Having your children who are going to school in Hebrew and discussing, Israeli subjects and coming home and speaking to you at home about these things is one way that Israeli public life was kind of interpolating even people who don't speak Hebrew and are understood by the mainstream as outside of public life. So it's not really, it's not just the language of Hebrew, but the very fact of speaking Hebrew in public life that is interesting, and that kind of reverberates throughout their domestic lives.
So is this where your perspective as a linguistic anthropology comes in handy?
Yes.
I mean, because if you think at another group, the Palestinians inside Israel, the Israeli Arabs, who have this sort of linguistic and cultural, I wouldn't say autonomy necessarily, but they are separate in that sense. They have their own public discourse that they do tap into the Hebrew language public discourse every now and again, and increasingly so. But still, they are, at least in the eyes of Israeli Jews, a separate group. And the Latinos, as you describe, have almost entirely merged themselves, or at least try to, in the hegemonic Hebrew language discourse. Is this where, really going back to the beginning of the question, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But really where your perspective as a linguistic anthropologist helps?
Yeah, I think so, because we don't separate out, language as just a kind of grammatical structure or a set of styles, but rather we try to understand the use of language in its various contexts. And by looking closely at the use of language across a series of, contexts and sites and circumstances, you can see how the kind of publicity of Israeli national public life suffuses the worlds of many people. I suspect that it suffuses the worlds of many Palestinian citizens as well, and that it's a very kind of complex process of creating the boundary and having that boundary kind of be blurred. I don't want to comment too much on how Palestinians participate, because I think it's actually a very complex process, and I don't necessarily agree that they're so outside.
I said they were perceived as being
perceived as being outside. So, that's a very kind of complex process. And I think the Latinos as well. I mean, that one of my chapters is dedicated to the discussion of a short-lived Latino Tel Aviv-based magazine that was based on a group of people that would regularly show up on Saturdays to the soccer field at Charles Gore Park. And there was this magazine that was produced, and the most famous part of the magazine was the gossip column called La Alcachofa. And so everyone, kind of saw themselves in public in that magazine. Gossip was an important part of Latino public life. And yet at the same time, I try to show how it hits limits when you try to convert that kind of publicity into a claim on citizenship, right? So that this is very hard to convert that way of having a public life into a claim of publicity that would be recognized by Israeli politicians in the mainstream.
One of the more interesting / problematic, really, it depends on who you talk to, of ethnography is really the presence of the ethnographer in the situation that he or she describes or seeks to document and analyze. And your story, you personally, is really twice as interesting / problematic because on the one hand, you are a Latino yourself. You were born in Chile. You speak Spanish fluently. That's your mother tongue. On the other hand, you are a Hebrew-speaking Israeli Jew as well. The fact that you have so many layers of relevant identities is really fascinating. I think, Goffman is probably turning over in his grave because, so much joy that you can just, put it on and take it off like that. What can you tell me about that? Did it help? Did it hinder your research?
It was interesting that there's numerous kind of tropes about the ethnographer in the field of feeling the moment where you realize that you're doing everything wrong and that no one has actually told you. That's often a piece that is used in ethnographic writing, or was for a long time ago. One of the things that hit me very early on, it's not actually in the book, is that I was addressed sometimes as the native rather than being the one who was out of place. That is, Latinos would come to me and ask me questions. For example, what should they do if one of their neighbors had passed away? Should they go, and what kind of food should they take to the Shiva?
A native as an Israeli.
Yeah, that's right. So they were suddenly addressing me. Now, I don't identify as, I've lived in Israel off and on for a long time. I'm not an Israeli citizen. But yes, as a Jew, as a fluent Hebrew speaker, as someone who has family here, I was understood as being from the place. And this was kind of a reversal of roles, because in some sense I wanted to, when I first got here and started working, or when I first started working with Latin American labor migrants, I wanted to understand how they understood the transformations that they were undergoing by being in constant contact with Israelis. So I wanted them to explain that to me. And on the other hand, they saw me as being somebody who could help them. Another layer to that was that, many times when I was just at, birthday parties or in other kind of cultural events, people just saw me as a Chilean. No matter how many times I would remind them that I'm an anthropologist, that I'm doing a study about Latinos in Israel.
Because of your accent.
Because I speak, fluent Spanish without any kind of noticeable English or Hebrew accent, because I was born in Chile, even though I grew up in Canada. And I would often try to emphasize my Canadianness to seem a little bit more different. But it did, and I guess the third layer to that is that because I quickly volunteered with a group that helped labor migrants, the hotline for migrant workers, I think it was called in English, and it's now called the Hotline for Migrants and Refugees, which celebrated its 20th anniversary. Wonderful.
Yeah, Kav Laoved in Hebrew.
No, זה לא קו לעובד, מוקד סיוע.
Sorry.
Yeah, the Moked. I volunteered there and therefore had a lot of information, for example, about the campaign for citizenship. And they understood me as being from Zchuyot Adam. They understood me as being from what a lot of Latinos called human rights, meaning this organization or other organizations. So I was also kind of native in the sense that I was playing this role of mediating Latino claims to the Israeli public and to the Israeli state.
Did it not skew your findings in any way? I mean, the fact that your own story is really so present, at every possible interaction, I know that I would be concerned if I were you. Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it, adds some, interesting layers to your findings, to your research.
But I wasn't unique. The Moked was there, Kav Laoved was there, all of these organizations that helped to deal with the difficulties of labor migrants were all there. There were important people that were playing these roles before I got to the field. I was just taking up roles that were already there. So there was not, I was special because I had lots of time as an anthropologist.
And very little money.
Very little money. But I was doing things that were already true to Israeli society and to the Latino community that was integrated and not integrated in all kinds of interesting ways. So I don't, I played that role, but that doesn't mean that I reconstituted it or made something out of nothing.
Going back to that constant negotiation between formal and substantive citizenships, do you think that the case of the Latinos or other groups in that period of time, we're talking about the last decade, the first decade of this century, right? Yeah. Did it have any knock-on effects on the way citizenship is understood and practiced in Israel in broader terms, legal and otherwise?
Well, first of all, there was the very fact, so we haven't yet mentioned this, but there was the formal recognition of the children of Latin Americans over 3 different government resolutions.
Allowing them to stay, essentially.
Giving them a pathway to citizenship, the children who had grown up here, first in 2005 in a very restrictive way, then that was expanded in 2006, and then there was a third one in 2010. I might add that all of these were under right-wing prime ministers, Sharon, Olmert, and Bibi Netanyahu.
Well, you can say that about every government decision in the last 20 years, but okay, go on.
Sure. But it's interesting, the fact that one of the things that is very interesting about this case, and I know you asked me about something else, but I'm just going to make this point. The fact that these kids there was not political will when they spoke in Hebrew to deport them. That is a very interesting fact about Israeli public life and Israeli citizenship. That is, there's no law, as anyone from the Moked would tell you, there's no law that prevented the government from rounding up all these kids and putting them in, detention centers. We're witnessing it right now in the U.S. and deporting them. There was no law. And yet the political will of seeing native Hebrew-speaking kids, because even if they came here as very young, they ended up being basically native Hebrew speakers, in jail was more than the public or politicians could bring themselves to do.
Also, maybe because there were relatively few.
And because there were relatively few, yes.
Okay. So
and I'll get to that. But this does connect to your question about knock-on effects. Certainly, there's the big fear against granting them citizenship, and I'm sure this is what's playing out in other places in the world as well, is the idea that there aren't just a few, but that this could be a precedent for granting citizenship to other quote-unquote non-Jews. And that is a bureaucratic fear that was very present in all the writing against granting citizenship from attorneys that represented the Ministry of Interior, and was, until very late in the game, one of the issues that was preventing the passage of these resolutions. It was only because it could be established that there were very few.
Yeah, but is there an element of truth in that? Has the precedent been evoked since?
I haven't seen it. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I've seen advertisements and whatnot that have been sponsored regarding maybe asylum seekers who've come from Sudan or Eritrea or whatever, who came as children and who speak Hebrew. I've seen them make claims based on similar kinds of things, as that we're here, we speak Hebrew, we're growing up here. But certainly what's happening right now, there's the threat of, I think it's 50 Filipino families that are being threatened with deportation. And the same kinds of claims are being made. The kids are growing up here, they belong here. To deport them would be traumatic. Mm-hmm. That claim, I think, as a public claim, has had knock-on effects. I think it's also made possible the idea that Israeli citizenship can be understood under different terms, which is really what it was keeping up bureaucrats in the Ministry of Interior, right? Is that perhaps there's another way to think about who belongs here.
To my mind, it's really similar to immigrants from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, who are not halakhically Jewish. Mm-hmm. I mean, according to the law of return, you can become an Israeli citizen if you have one Jewish grandparent, and many of them...
Or if you're married to somebody.
Or if you're married.
Or the child of.
Yeah, but that's relatively fewer people.
Yeah.
There were tens of thousands of people who came to Israel and had just one Jewish grandparent and didn't grow up Jewish at all, or very little to do with Judaism and Jewish identity. Yet they became, just like your Latinos, they became part and parcel of Israeli society, of the Jewish Israeli society, because to an extent they made the right claim. So really, it tells us that, especially this in Israel, this tension between the Jewish state and the fact that there are modern migration laws that cater to people who wish to come here is really always fluid. Is what I want to say. It's really always fluid because it's this negotiation that just never ends.
Yes, I agree with that. So, there's a big difference in the fact that these families that came from the former Soviet Union did start out at least with formal citizenship. And of course, that makes it does make a big difference in what kind of substantive citizenship you can...
No, but the fact that maybe that negotiation was made prior to their coming here. I mean...
Yes.
En masse in a way, right?
Yes.
And by proxy, right?
Yes. And proving that you did have a Jewish grandparent and needing the documentation and all the rest. But where I do agree with you is that I would not separate out what these Latino families went through in arriving to Israel and adjusting and all the different kinds of things that happen when you arrive to a new society and you don't necessarily speak the language and don't know how to speak in different kinds of contexts. I agree with you. They went through things that many authorized immigrants, olim, go through in having to deal with, how do I get an apartment? How do I deal with Israelis who seem to be so mad all the time when they talk to me? That was one of the, most common descriptions of Israelis, as you know from reading the book, that they are maleducados. And educación in Spanish has to do with being a polite person, with being a person who's well-bred. And for Latin Americans coming here, the way that Israelis talk on the street kind of thing was like an incredible amount of maleducación, of quote-unquote rudeness. It's a complex thing. But
they're not alone in thinking that about Israelis.
Not alone in thinking about it. And there's all kinds of ideologies about why Israelis talk that way. And it's not actually true of all Israelis, not true in all situations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that was a very strong sentiment. And that's the kind of thing that I think anybody coming here has to go through. It's part of the transformation of arriving.
One last question. I mean, the parallels to what's going on in the United States right now, we simply cannot escape them. That has been evoked by you at several points throughout this interview. Is it really fair to compare the two situations? We said that, on the Israeli case is very different because there are relatively few and therefore it's relatively manageable, at least in the way it's perceived publicly. Are there any lessons that you learned from the Israeli case that you think can be applied to the American case?
I certainly think that there's a similarity with the case of the Dreamers in the United States. I'm not thinking so much about the children that are currently being detained in centers and around the United States that were separated at the border. In the fact that they understand themselves as being part of this country in all but citizenship, right? Or that isn't part of the United States. They had grown up, they had made lives, and that in some sense where they were exercising a kind of substantive citizenship certainly not in a full way, lacking formal citizenship, but in many ways. Are there lessons that can be applied in the fact that there needs to be strong campaigns that will lead to formal recognition is obviously an important factor. I think that
and those campaigns should be based on we are American, we speak English flawlessly. We would like to be as American as any other person.
That's one of the things that you hear a lot from not all Dreamers, but from some Dreamers. The idea that we pay taxes. The kind of things that you think of in public speech in the U.S. We're taxpayers. We want to go to the university. We want to make our lives here. And at the same time, we shouldn't be afraid of the changes that kind of recognition will mean, whether we're talking about the United States or Canada or anywhere else, or in this case, the Israeli state.
All right, Professor Alejandro Paz, an anthropologist at the University of Toronto and the author of the newly published book, Latinos in Israel, Language and Unexpected Citizenship. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Gilad.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, as well as the Israel Institute for the generous support. And now we've got a small request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. All you have to do is go to the ratings and review section and write us one, hopefully a glowing one. And of course, you can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And don't forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. And of course, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.